You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Juliet Cutler.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories today. We've got a fantastic show coming up for you. But before we jump into that, let me tell you about a couple of sponsors today. R.J. Pinero and his brand new book, Chilling Effect, a global climate thriller. A ruthless eco-terrorist, a woman determined to stop him. Chilling Effect, R.J. Pinero's newest thriller, explores a world in the not-too-distant future where terrorism is taken to a new level, one with world-ending consequences. You never know what you're capable of until the monster inside of you pushes you beyond your moral line in the sand. These are the opening thoughts of former climatologist William Christed as he prepares to attack our delicate ecosystem. He's hell-bent on avenging his father's death and will go to extremes of terrorism never before seen, all to strike a blow to those whose hubris led to his father's demise. He will take full advantage of the greed and narcissism ever present in the world, as well as the fragility of our planet to ecological terrorism, and use it to plot a scenario so grim, yet so compellingly real it could have ripped from today's headlines. Check out the brand new thriller Chilling Effect from R.J. Pinero. Michael Anderle has a brand new series that's launching. It's called Opus X, and the first book is Obsidian Detective. Two rebels whose worlds collide on a planetary level. On the fringes of human space, a murder will light a fuse and send two different people colliding together. She lives on Earth, where peace among the population is a given. He is on the fringe of society, where authority is how much power you wield. She's from the powerful, the elite, he's with the military. Both want the truth, but is revealing the truth good for society? Check out Obsidian Detective, the very first book that's up for pre-order now, from the new series Opus X by Michael Anderle. If you love comics the way I do, go check out Cool Comics in My Collection at edgosney.com. Ed runs one of the best comics blogs on the internet. New episodes each Thursday come out, digging into the things that we have loved about comics and comic collecting. There's something there for everyone. Go check out Cool Comics in My Collection at edgosney.com. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today I'm really excited to have Juliet Cutler on the show with me. She has a fantastic new book. It's called Among the Maasai, a memoir. And guys, this book is one of those that just sticks with you. When you close that back cover, you feel like you're taking these people in this culture along with you. And I think that's the goal, to immerse us in your story along with you. Thanks for joining me today, Juliet.
Thanks, Hank. That was a high compliment. I'm really glad to be here today.
Well, thank you. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
So my grandmother was a very influential woman in my life, though unfortunately I lived quite far away from her. I grew up in Montana, and she lived in Central Florida. And what that meant is that I exchanged a lot of letters with her. And she was probably the first person in my life that told me that I was a great writer. And I don't know at a very young age that I was a great writer, but she sure made me feel that way. And I think that was the first time I began to think, wow, maybe this is a vocation for me. And from there, I had some other influential people in my life, namely a couple of high school teachers who really helped me hone the craft and begin down a lifelong path of writing.
I love those stories of early encouragement that writers get, because, as you know, there are a lot of dark and lonely days in a writer's life where it's just you and the manuscript. And, is this thing ever going to become a thing? And will anyone ever understand what I'm trying to say? Will it connect emotionally with anyone? And invariably you pull back on those early pieces of encouragement, and they just mean so much, and it means so little or it costs so little to encourage a youngster in that way, and it's something that you can carry with you for the rest of your life.
Right. I've been really fortunate to have a number of good mentors in my life, kind of all through time, starting with my grandmother and some high school teachers, and then as I lived in Tanzania, I had some great Tanzanian mentors there. And once I returned to the States and began a professional career as a writer, I've also had a number of great mentors in that realm as well. And thus, I think it's also really important for those of us to write to be mentors, one to another, to people who are coming in our footsteps. And so I seek to do that as well.
You were also so fortunate to have that relationship with your grandmother and letter writing. That is such a lost art today, and I fear that kids coming up now don't know what they're missing in an age of instant communication. And there's something about sitting down with a piece of paper and gathering your thoughts, trying to figure out what is important to tell, because you may not get a response for a couple of weeks, and there's real craft to that in an age of just firing off a text with all misspelled words, and that's something that we're going to be sorely missing pretty soon.
Yeah, that's so true. I still try to sit down at least a few times a year. My grandmother is no longer living, but I think my mother also inherited that drive to write letters. And so my mom and I exchange letters very regularly. So it's sort of a family art, if you will.
Yeah, I love that. So at what point, Juliet, did you realize that what you said pretty early on that encouragement led you to believe that you could be a writer and that you could do that? What were some of the steps that you took that brought you closer to what you do now?
Well, one of the ways I open the book is talking about how there's no better way to learn something than to teach it.
Right.
And so
I believe that.
Yeah. So I think I really learned the craft of writing by starting to teach it. And I did that in graduate school when I taught Composition 101 to freshmen. I think there's something about teaching others where you really begin to learn how to do it yourself. But I also think, we can reduce writing to its parts and pieces in order to teach it. But I think there is an art to it as well. And I think, that's something that is harder to teach, but something that I think we gain from the experiences we have, the reading that we do. And that to me feels like something that's been a little bit more innate, if you will. Like I think everyone comes into the world with certain gifts, and mine happens to be the gift of words.
What was your first outlet to start writing for and maybe publish some of your work?
Right. So this book that I've written, I've kind of done on the side. Professionally, I'm also a writer. I develop exhibits for places like the National Park Service and museums, not only in the United States, but around the world. And so I really think of myself in that capacity as a writer and a storyteller. If you think about some of the great exhibits that you've seen when you go to a visitor center at a national park or to a really wonderful museum, really those exhibits are stories in 3 dimensions. And so my role in that process is really like I would start any writing piece, is to think about what is the story, what is the narrative arc, and then how does that get expressed. In exhibits, it's sometimes in words, it's sometimes with objects or with experiences, but I think that sort of has served for me as a way that I've really been able to stretch my writing and my storytelling ability into a lot of different types of stories.
And you're absolutely right about the storytelling element that goes into what you do at your day job, and we are thankful that when we encounter one of those places, that there's a writer behind that who cares and that she cares about the story to help communicate that. Do you feel like the work that you do there helps the side work that you do with your new memoir? Or do you ever feel like Yeah, I've done this all day. I don't have anything left for me. Like, how do you balance? We talk about work-life balance all the time, but when you work as a writer and then your hobby or your side project is also a writer, do those things ever conflict or do they feed one another?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one
Or
I still
both?
kind of grapple with, because I think that that's hard um, in our modern era when everything is moving so fast and you're constantly accessible. I think carving out the time to sit down and write can be really challenging. And as you said, even finding the energy to do that, the creative energy. And so, yes, of course, I experienced that conflict. I've also become fairly good at um, knowing my better times of the day and for different levels of energy, if you will. So I know that I'm really sharp first thing in the morning, and so I'm an early riser, and that will be the time of day where I will do the writing piece because I'm freshest and I'm sharpest then. And then as the day goes on, I sort of begin to fade a little bit, and that's when I move more into like the email realm and the business part of things and not so much the creative part.
Gotcha. What led you to East Africa? How did this the work that you were doing and your college experience, how did you wind up among the Maasai?
So I was this was between when I finished college. I guess I had one semester of college left, and I was going to go back and do my student teaching. So I did a student teaching stint in North Dakota, actually, and came out as a certified secondary English teacher. But the summer before I did that student teaching, I was working as a camp counselor and a backpack guide in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness in Montana. And I was predominantly working with middle school and high school kids, and a group came out from Minnesota with an adult advisor. And that adult advisor served on the board for an organization called Operation Bootstrap Africa. And at the time, this nonprofit organization was just building the Maasai Secondary School for Girls, and they were looking for a volunteer English teacher out there. And I think this gentleman saw me on trail, sort of cooking over a propane stove and living in a tent, and he thought, "Wow, she's made of tough stuff. She might do really well in sort of a remote setting in East Africa." So he started telling me the stories of these young women who face extraordinary challenges and barriers to education. Most Maasai girls really are unable to continue their education past primary school if they even get to primary school. And there are a range of reasons for that include sort of culturally defined roles as well as early marriage. Many Maasai girls are married at the age of 12 or 13. The Maasai still practice polygamy, so sometimes that's to men 2 or 3 times their age, and they are a second or third wife. And so the expectation is that that's sort of the pathway for a Maasai girl, and yet many Maasai girls know sort of inherently some way that education has the power to transform the conditions of poverty for themselves and also for their families. And so these girls would literally, and they still do this. I mean, they still show up on the doorstep of the school regularly, run away from home, from everything that they know with nothing, and show up on the doorstep of the school begging for a place, wanting to continue their education. And when I heard these stories, I was just sort of enamored, and it hit me sort of right in the heart. And I thought I'd sort of always wanted to study abroad, but I also really cared a lot about issues of social justice. And I thought, well, maybe I can go over there and teach, and maybe I can do some good. And so that's what I did.
Wow. How long were you there?
So I lived there for 2 years. This was in 1999 and 2000. So I now have a 20-year connection to the school. I return almost annually, and my role now is largely as a fundraiser in the United States. So, in the same way that professionally I tell stories, I think good fundraisers know how to tell stories well too. And so,
They better.
um, yeah, I'm telling the story now in the hopes of gaining support for these young women who really have no way to go to school without the support of folks who care about their stories.
Right, right. Um, where did you grow up again?
I grew up in Billings, Montana.
Okay, so Montana. And when you encountered the folks that said, "Oh, she looks like she's made of tough stuff," did you feel at the time that being from Montana gave you, a certain edge that would have benefited you there among the Maasai?
I don't know. I think there's the face we show the world, right? And then there's the way we actually feel. And what I can say, and I think what comes through in the narrative of the book is that I was really scared. Um, and in some ways I knew enough to be scared, but I didn't know enough to know what I didn't know, right? And so the book is really an exploration of a young woman who goes over to help and finds that it's much more complex than she could have realized, and that um, helping and empowering are two different things, and that local leaders are critical because change really comes from the inside out, not from the outside in. And so, to answer your question, I don't know that Montana particularly prepared me for the experience. I will say that I spent a lot of time traipsing around with my dad in the outdoors, and I have a particular appreciation for the natural beauty of Montana. And there are a lot of ways that Tanzania and its natural beauty resonated with me because of that.
You mentioned that you had a heart for social justice, and you wanted to know how you could help, and so you decided to go and teach. And as you've alluded to, there are, and as you talk in the book, there are many things that you encounter that are just kind of out of your control. And a lot of people think of social justice and their idea of that is going on Twitter and and getting, some dander raised. But you put your feet to it and did what you could to make a difference. What do you encourage other people that maybe have a heart for this and see the need? Will volunteering make a difference? When you came out of this experience, did you feel fulfilled, or did you feel like there's so much more work yet to do? Like, how do you feel like that you made a difference in this situation?
I think it's really easy to sometimes get overwhelmed by the problems in the world. In the 24-hour news cycle, it's easy to be bombarded with all that's wrong in the world. And I think that sometimes, even for me, sort of causes me to want to just sit on the couch and do nothing because it seems so hopeless. But I think when I get to that space, I think about my time in Tanzania, and I think about colleagues on the ground in Tanzania who are every day rolling up their sleeves and going to work with young women who really need help. And I think, that's where real change happens, is eyeball to eyeball, one-on-one with real people. And so for me, that's always where I go to when I get sort of overwhelmed by sort of the large systemic problems. And I think one of the great things about 20 years of retrospect is that I can see how education has really transformed the lives of individual students. I know young women who I saw stumble into that school having just run away from a forced marriage, who are now founders of nonprofits, who are speaking at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So that really gives me hope that sort of at that level, at the local sort of grassroots level, working together, we really can make a difference.
Right. Well, as a teacher at the school there, you obviously were teaching language, writing, English. Those were very may have been kind of superficial in the grand scheme of things. When it comes to the other parts of that, the relationship building and all of that. But you mentioned earlier that the greatest way to learn something is by teaching. What did you learn in this experience? Maybe about the art of writing, but also just for your personal growth. What did you come away with?
There are a lot of lessons that I took from Tanzania. And, as somebody who is a lover of language, I think it's really interesting to explore words and what they mean in another language. And so Swahili is the language that's spoken in Tanzania. And there's a word there called mgeni. And so mgeni literally translates in English as guest. But there is no word in Swahili for stranger. And so if you think about, if you follow the assumption that language follows culture, and you think about that for a moment, what does it mean to live in a culture where there are no strangers, only guests? And so I think one of the great things I took away from my experience in Tanzania is this idea that we can all treat one another as guests. And I really felt welcomed as a guest there, never as a stranger. And so that, of course, is one lesson. I think another one is around the definition of poverty. I think in this country, we almost entirely define poverty in economic terms. But I think poverty, what you will find in Tanzania is that while by our definition of poverty, people there are living on something like $2 a day, which is about $730 a year. So that in terms of economic poverty is quite dramatic. But what does social poverty look like, or poverty of community? And, what I found there was that there was just a real richness of community that I was welcomed into in a way I'd never experienced before. And I think there are some lessons that in our culture we can take from that as we face statistics like the highest suicide rates we've seen in a very long time here in the United States, that people are increasingly isolated and yearning for community. And how do we find that?
We talked about a lot of the situations that some of these young women are coming from when they come to the school, and we all know that education empowers people to be able to make better decisions, to move their life forward. But what are some specific ways? And we hear that all the time, that education empowers people and gives people opportunity. But what are some of those specific things that an education at a school like this gives the young women in Tanzania?
Well, I think one of the greatest things it gives them is their voices back. I can tell the story of Grace, who she was born when I lived in Tanzania. And so I've watched Grace grow up. And when Grace was a child, when she would speak so softly I could barely hear her, and she would cover her mouth when she spoke, and there was a timidness about her. Now, Grace just graduated from in Tanzania there are 2 levels of high school, so she just graduated from the first level of high school, and Grace, she carries herself in an entirely different way now. She's confident, she's not afraid to speak. And so I think at a very basic level, we're giving young women confidence to chart their own courses. So that's one thing. And then I think there are all kinds of international studies that point to educated women have fewer children. And we're talking about a culture where the average Maasai woman has 8, 9, 10 children. So a lot of children. So smaller families, healthier families, more economic self-sufficiency, better health conditions for the entire family, and even there's new studies out now that point to educating women and girls as improving the environmental qualities of a community as well.
Well, after the 2 years, you come back home. Where does the book come from? The new book that's available everywhere. It just came out yesterday. It's called Among the Maasai, a memoir. How did you start to collect your experiences, and where did this book come from?
Well, I think the initial impetus for the book was really a personal one in that I'm able to articulate a lot today because I've had 20 years to reflect on it and I've written a book about it. When I first, I started this book a decade ago, and for me, it was really a way to begin to make sense of what the experiences meant to me. So to document them, to take them apart and put them back together, and to really reflect on how the experience shaped me. So that was sort of the initial thought behind it. And then, as it developed into something that was cohesive, that could be a book, I started to think about the universal sort of pieces of the story, the urge I think most humans have to live a purposeful life, to make a difference in the world, to help others. And I saw it then as something that might have broader appeal to a wider audience. And also, all proceeds from the sale of the book are going back to support education and safety for Maasai girls in Tanzania. So it is also for me a tool to get the story out in hopes that people will be by buying the book, you're supporting the school. But if you want to do more, there are ways to do that as well. You can visit my website, and there are some links there on ways to give.
Excellent. Juliet, when you're collecting these stories and these experiences and trying to get them sorted out, what makes a great memoir or any sort of narrative nonfiction is the narrative thread that runs through it, and that we are going on this journey with you as you're going through all these memories and all the people that you met and all of this. Where did the narrative thread for it start coming to you?
So obviously the story is timeline driven, so there's that sort of thread immediately. That said, this book did not come out sort of in that fashion, so it sort of came out as short stories, like this experience that happened, that experience that happened. And so there really was a process of putting those stories in time. So I could remember the story, but when did it happen in relationship to this other story? And what is the thread that runs through in terms of those 2 years, but then in terms of the broader experience I've had beyond the 2 years. I think the bulk of the book is that 2 years in Tanzania, but I also do talk about what happens after that. And then there are also the threads of some students' stories that run through the book, and how those stories intersected with my story, how we came to know one another and interact with one another.
Well, the book is absolutely fantastic. It is a journey that we get to go along with you. This definitely opened my eyes to issues that I wasn't even aware of, and that's what makes a great book, is it opens our world up and allows us to go on a trip with you. The book Among the Maasai is out, available everywhere now. Juliet, you mentioned your website. Where can people find you to dig into your work and connect with you online?
Yeah, it's just my name, julietcutler.com.
Excellent. We're going to put a link to the book, and remember, everyone, as Juliet said, the proceeds of this book are going to fund the work still going on there, and we can be a part of that by supporting it, by buying the book. Thank you, Juliet. We're going to send everyone to see you and to buy a copy of the book. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you, Hank. It's been a real pleasure.
Stay tuned now for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
They made instant coffee and laid blankets over a pile of hay. He helped Kate pull off her boots. She volunteered for first watch, but Jason couldn't sleep. "Talk to me?" he whispered. Kate sipped her coffee. She sat silhouetted against the soft navy sky. A field of stars hung above her. The constellations peered in through the windows and slats. "How about a story?" "Sure. My mom used to tell this one. It's the legend of the Star Maidens." He watched her words as she spoke, her story illustrated by puffs of vapor that mixed with the steam of her coffee. "Long ago, a Mohican brave became lost in this valley. He'd followed a red deer deep into the woods, but the deer had vanished, and as twilight fell, he lost his way. He searched the heavens. He saw a bright star and followed it. It shone upon a clearing in the woods. Spook Rock lay at the center, emanating magic. And in the starlight, he discovered the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. He discovered a star maiden. She was dancing with her sisters, and all 7 were naked. "Oh, really?" Jason whispered. 7 naked star maidens? Shh. Why do these things never happen to me? The brave decided he must take the star maiden for his wife, so he seized her and threw her over his shoulder, and she loved him for his courage. They married and had a son. Then what? Then it gets sad. The star maiden missed her home. She gazed at the sky every night. She loved her husband and her baby very much, but she missed her sisters, and she especially missed the dancing. So she snuck away one night and returned to the sacred rock, and she begged her sisters, please appear to me for one last dance. They came to her and took her into the sky. Kate's silhouette swayed. One last dance. It was wonderful. And when the dance was finished, they sent her back to Earth. She thought that she'd been away for only a little while. But that one dance had taken many, many years. She ran back to her husband, back to her baby, but they were gone. Her home was empty. The hunter had stopped waiting for her. He'd given up hope that she would return. He'd taken their child and had left with his tribe. One last dance had cost her everything, and she had no home at all. Jason could sense something roiling inside Kate, some brew of feelings that the story had stirred. He wanted to leap up, to grab her and carry her off, his star maiden and wife. She climbed up to Spook Rock. She heard no music, only wind. She died there of her grief. She dwindled and lost her star form. She became a will-o'-the-wisp, fluttering between the trees. And see that constellation? The Pleiades. Those are her 7 sisters, watching down from heaven. And, to this day, if a girl has lost her true love, she can go to Spook Rock and dance, and the star maidens will bless her. They'll grant her one wish, any wish at all, except one. They can't make her true love return.